So it's been a while since I've made like a denominations video where I talked about why I like the denomination. But there's one denomination of Christianity that I really like. It's definitely one of my favorites, and that definitely would have to be the Anglican tradition. And in this video, I'm going to be using the terms Anglican and Episcopal interchangeably. But I really appreciate the Anglican tradition for a variety of reasons. And I've been to a lot of Anglican churches on my church hops. So it's like there's two examples that really stick out to me on my church hops. One time I went to a very conservative Reformed Episcopal church. It was called Anglican on the building. And this church was very tiny, like 12 people. And they were meeting inside something that used to be a horse stable. Very tiny little building. And they didn't even have a priest. They would have to call on a priest every 2 weeks from like Raleigh. He would bless communion, so they would have communion the week he was there, and also they'd have the saved communion for the week that he wasn't there. All they had was a deacon on staff, and I don't think he was paid. I think that was just a volunteer position. But even though the church was very tiny, like I knew in this building, if it was a non-denominational church, it would be as ugly as sin. It would. I don't think they'd rent that building, but it'd be very ugly. There would be the worship, be rock and roll church and all that. But this church, the worship was very beautiful, and the building was insanely beautiful. I mean, considering it was literally used to be a horse stable, it was a very beautiful building. A lot of beautiful art, beautiful crosses. It was just very beautiful. In fact, they'd even put kneelers in for communion, and they had a little altar area. It was all very beautiful, and it was just a very beautiful little church. And only 12 people were going to this church. It was very tiny, but very beautiful. I really appreciated it. And also another interesting thing about this church is that they were actually meeting at 5 o'clock, which is the only time I've actually been to a church that they were doing it, not in the morning, but in the afternoon, which is very interesting. But anyways, this church, I really did appreciate it. It was very beautiful, and they were using the 1928 Book of Common Prayer. In fact, they even gave me a free Book of Common Prayer, and it was so beautiful. It's just like, it was very beautiful worship, very beautiful building. The people were very nice to me. It was just, I even went out for Mexican food with them afterwards, but it was just a wonderful visit. I mean, everything about the service was very beautiful. And what really stuck out to me about this story is they had nothing, like literally had nothing at all. They had barely any money for a church, but they were still, with what little they had, they were making a very beautiful service, a very beautiful building. That always really stuck with me. And that tells you a lot about Anglicans, because I can tell you most other traditions of Christianity, if they were put into that situation where they had almost nothing when it comes to funds, they wouldn't care about a beautiful building. They wouldn't care about beautiful worship. They wouldn't care about that. But with the Anglicans, they do care. Anglicans care a lot about beauty. And that's something I think that we really need. Like, in my opinion, I think Anglicans care more about beauty than Catholics. I know that'd be a hot take, and this kind of leads me to my other story. And that is, one time I did go to a Catholic church. Early in my church hopping, I went to a Catholic church. And this Catholic church, it was started as very antisocial. Like, nobody really wanted to talk with me, which is very weird, because most Protestant churches, when a new guy comes in, like, oh my goodness, a new potential member, please talk to us, But in this church, even though, it was mostly old people. They just, for some reason, did not care that a new person had walked in. But anyways, apart from just being very antisocial, the other thing that really stuck out to me about this building is how 60s it felt. I really love the 60s, well, sometimes, but, anyways, nothing against the 60s, but, the building itself felt like it was from the 60s. It looked like it was from the 60s, and it wasn't that pretty. It was a very ugly building, honestly. I remember the stained glass in the back. It was very abstract and didn't really make any sense. The building wasn't really pretty. It just felt all wrong, and the worship didn't help. It was a guitar mass, and the priest, he was a substitute priest, but I don't know. It was a pretty lousy service, to be honest. And of course, I wasn't able to receive communion. I probably could have received communion if I wanted to, because nobody would have checked. But out of respect to the Catholic faith, I didn't go receive communion. And I don't know. It didn't feel all that great. It was a pretty lousy service, in my opinion. I really wasn't blown away by any of it. But then I go to the Anglican, because the service had let out so quickly. I had enough time to go to the Episcopal church right down the street. And this was actually a conservative Episcopal church that just stood out to me because it was June, and it wasn't doing Pride Month. It was a conservative Episcopal church, And I went to this church, and it really blew me away because of how beautiful it was. It was a very beautiful building. They had this giant organ in the back, and I mean, the service was very beautiful. It was a beautiful building, beautiful worship. Sorry, that's a B, but it was a beautiful, beautiful building, and it was just very reverent and beautiful worship. And I really liked the priests. The people were very nice to me. It was like night and day to the Catholic Church down the street. What really stuck out to me, the Catholic Church, even though people brag about how beautiful Catholic churches are, and some Catholic churches are legitimately very beautiful, but the impression I've gotten is that Catholics care a lot. Most Catholics today care a lot less about beauty than most Anglicans. Anglicans still care a lot about beauty and worship, beauty and everything. They still care a lot about beauty, and it's just I feel like that's lacking a lot of Catholic churches today, and that contrast really stuck out to me between the beauty of the Anglican church down the street and the beauty of the Catholic church. And I don't know, that always just really stuck out to me, and that how much more friendly the Anglican church was. Like these Catholics, they were very antisocial, but the Anglicans were very social, and that always really stuck out to me. And the Anglican church is just very beautiful all around. Every Anglican church I've been to has been beautiful, and I've been to Episcopal churches, I've been to Anglican churches, and both have been very beautiful. And, that's just one impression I've always gotten. It's like the Anglican church is beautiful. And actually thinking about the Catholic church, like one of the first Episcopal churches I went to was actually the worship center was built, like the worship they were meeting in. It was actually built into the 70s, but yet even though it felt a bit like the 70s in there, the building was still very beautiful and for the most part timeless. But when I went to that Catholic church, I don't know, it didn't feel all that great. It felt pretty ugly. But it was just such a beautiful, it was just all these churches are very beautiful, not just the building, but the worship itself, very beautiful. And one of the things I especially learned from the Episcopalians is that they are strong believers that how you pray really affects how you believe, that faith and prayer are very strongly interconnected. In fact, I heard an Episcopal church on the 10-minute Bible hours, Episcopal priests say on the 10-minute Bible hour that Anglicans really believe in the monkhood of all believers. And Anglicanism is always very, very much a tradition of prayer. And this goes back to the history of the Anglican church, Well, kind of talking about the history of the Anglican church, it's very interesting. Talking with Anglicans, they'll say, like I've heard with Anglicans like online, that they'll say the Anglican church really goes all the way back to Joseph of Arimathea, who in tradition brought Christianity to England, and even with some traditions brought the Holy Grail to England. But because England's an island, England's always had a very distinct form of Christianity, different from the continent. And some of the more conservative Anglican apologists will say that the Anglican Church actually existed before, like, the Catholic Church in England, because England's an island, and therefore, like, it was kind of separate from the rest of the continent and from Christianity further south. So it's like they'll say that the Church of England was like self-governing in England. And it's just very interesting, like the Anglicanism did kind of pre-exist before the Reformation, because Anglican just means, what Anglican just means is English Christianity. And since English Christianity's always had kind of its own distinct flavor because England's an island, and, there's always been like a conflict between the King of England and the Pope. Like I think King John considered doing something similar. I know he had like a very big disagreement with the Pope, King John. And because they'll say that Anglicanism kind of pre-existed the Reformation because Christianity in England pre-exists. It's always been different than Christianity on the continent. But then, of course, you have King Henry. And what I was trying to say earlier is that because the Anglican Church was founded for more political reasons than theological reasons, the Anglican Church has always been a lot less. It's always had, like, say with Lutherans, they have a very clear theological beginning. But with Anglicans, they don't really have so much a theological beginning. They have more of a political beginning. So Anglicanism has always been a bigger tent. And there's always been a lot more about how you pray than, of course, it does matter how you believe, but how you pray, how you worship, it's always been intertwined how you believe in Anglicanism. And Anglicans are very strong believers in worship and very beautiful worship and prayer. Anglicans, for instance, invented the, some call it the Protestant Rosary, some call it the Anglican Rosary. But they invented this tinier version of the Rosary that has all these different prayers, and that's taken off throughout the Protestant world. I've noticed that Anglicans have really always had very strong appreciation for prayer and worship. They have the most beautiful worship. I think they invented the Book of Common Prayer, which is actually the first ever study Bible, and starting at Study Bible, year-round Bible. It was actually the first ever year-round Bible. If you actually use the Book of Common Prayer correctly, you'll actually read the New Testament 3 times in a year and the Old Testament once in a year, which is very interesting. And the Anglican liturgy is actually rich with scripture. They'll have a reading from the Old Testament, a reading from an epistle, a reading from the gospel, and I always forget what the other reading was from, but they'll have like 4 different readings of the scriptures inside Anglican service, and there's just a lot of from the Psalms. I have a reading from the Psalms, of course. Yes, I'll have a reading from the Psalms, and and Anglican liturgy is so very beautiful, and it's just, I mean, for instance, Anglicans give us the King James Bible, the very beautiful King James Bible. It has a very rich and fluent English to it. And, a lot of Anglican church will still use the King James because it's their version of the Bible that they created. And most Anglican churches will have communion once a week, which I think is biblical. And the nice thing about the Anglican church is so Anglicans, I feel, are more reverent. Of course, this video is massive Anglican propaganda. I like the Anglican church over the Catholic church. And even over the Orthodox Church even. And one thing I really found the Anglicans is like they'll still kneel to receive communion. Like I even found this with Lutherans. Like a lot of churches, like a lot of Catholic churches, they don't kneel to receive communion anymore. They'll stand up and receive it. But in Anglican and Episcopal churches, you'll still most of the time kneel to receive communion, which I think is a lot more reverent towards communion. And also in the more conservative Anglican churches, a lot of priests will still face away from the congregation in the blessing of communion. And then you'll often still receive communion on the tongue, which I feel is a lot more reverent. And the great thing is that with the Anglican church is that you can have a lot more reverent communion service, where communion is done facing away from the congregation, where you receive communion on the tongue while kneeling, but you can still have open communion because Anglicans, by and large, nowadays believe inside open communion. As long as you're baptized, you can receive communion in most Anglican churches. And, it's just, I was just really appreciative about the Anglican tradition. Like, that they'll have a communion service like in beauty on par with the Catholic Church, with the Orthodox Church. But unlike the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church, you'll actually be able to receive communion at their church. And I always really like that about the Anglican Church. And it's just, the first ever time I received communion was at an Episcopal church. And I've always really just liked the Anglican tradition. It's very rich in tradition and history and rich in beauty. It's just so beautiful. That's the real reason I love the Anglican tradition. It's so rich and beautiful, and it's so beautiful. And another thing I like about the Anglican tradition is that it's a big tent tradition. So, like, going back to what I said before, about, like, Anglicanism is a lot more about, prayer and worship than it is about individual specific beliefs. This allows Anglicanism to be a very big tent tradition. So you have a few different forms of Anglicanism. You have evangelical Anglicanism, or some of them broke off and became Methodist, which I think is like the most pointless church split ever, because you can believe everything Methodists believe and still be a part of the Anglican Church. And the Anglicans even kept the exact same form of government, the Episcopal form of government. Methodist, I just feel like the Methodist Church was the most pointless split ever. But anyways, it's like, seriously, there was no good reason. In fact, the founders of Methodism, like Charles Wesley actually was buried in an Anglican church, and this was actually to make sure so that he was still loyal to the Church of England and that he'd not want to break from the Church of England. I've always thought it was a very pointless split, and that's kind of ironic because I'm shooting a Methodist hymnal right here. It's what you're looking at. It's a Methodist hymnal, and I don't know. I've always felt like it was such a pointless breakup. But anyways, Anglicanism is such a big tent. It's a big tent tradition. So it's like you have your evangelical Anglicans, you have your Reformed Anglicans, so the Calvinist Anglicans, you have your Anglo-Catholics. People, some of them are so Catholic that they're like pretty much just Catholics without the Pope. But it's very interesting is that, like, especially the Anglo-Catholics, but to a lesser extent the Anglican tradition, has come up with some very interesting ideas on stuff like, say, prayers to the saints. Like, a big controversy in the Protestant world is the idea of prayers to the saints. Like, in the Catholic and Orthodox Church, they believe it's not praying to the saints, it's asking the saints to pray for you, like you would ask a friend to pray for you. And of course, it is true that the book of Revelation says that the saints are praying for us, but there's nothing in the Bible that outright says, like, I can go, like, talk to the saints and ask for them to pray for me. But one thing I've noticed, like, some Anglicans do the Catholic way, but a lot of Anglicans have come up with a very interesting middle ground where, when praying to Jesus, praying to the Lord, asking for his, praying to him and he interceding for us, some of them will be like, this is a very interesting idea that some Anglicans have come up with, and that is that when we're talking to Jesus, they'll say, Jesus or Lord, or if you will, could you ask the Virgin Mary to pray for me? So it's like you would ask Jesus to ask the Virgin Mary or some other saint in heaven to pray for you instead of directly talking to the saint. You would ask Jesus, who is of course the intermediary between God and man. You would ask Jesus if he would will to allow for like the Virgin Mary to pray for you, which is a very interesting idea. And I've only really heard that from the Anglicans. But another very interesting idea is stuff like prayer to the dead. Anglicans actually kept prayer to the dead, prayer for the dead, I mean. And though some Anglicans later on would come to believe in stuff like purgatory again, the original reason they kept prayer for the dead is very interesting. Since God is in all places and all times, you can kind of like time travel pray. And a few people have talked about this, like time travel prayer. The fact is that since God is in all places and all times, you could technically, if you wanted to, you could pray for stuff that happened in the past. And what's very interesting about the idea of Anglican prayer for the dead is that it is praying even if they're dead. The idea is that, since, God is in all places and all times, even when they were alive, you can pray for them even though they're dead. You could pray for them, like, say, I don't know, your neighbor who died, who may not have been a Christian. You can pray that he was still saved and became a Christian at some point in his life. You can still pray for that even though he's dead. You could pray for that because God's in all places and all times, which is a very interesting way of viewing prayer for the dead. And that's something I just really appreciate about the Anglican tradition, is that it comes up with interesting ideas like that. And it's just a very interesting tradition of Christianity. I really appreciate how it's an evolving tradition, like it's a living tradition. Like, Anglicanism has, like, I think out of like most of the reform movements come out of the Anglican tradition. Like, we go back to, like, of course, the evangelical movement, the Methodist movement kind of comes up out of Anglicanism. The Anglican tradition goes stuff like the Oxford movement. A lot of those English guys, a famous English fellow like C.S. Lewis, and C.S. Lewis eventually became Catholic, but he started out as Anglican. And of course, famously, C.S. Lewis, did I say G.K.? I meant to say G.K. Chesterton started out Anglican, became Catholic. And then I meant to say C.S. Lewis remained Anglican. But, there was this big English movement over about 100 years ago. It started out in Anglicanism. And I think of stuff like, like even Pentecostalism, like some of the Pentecostal church I started out in the Anglican church in the beginning, which is very interesting. And Anglicanism has like a lot of movements of the Spirit over the years. I really appreciate the Anglican tradition. It's very much a rich and a vibrant tradition. I really appreciate it. And a lot of people are becoming Anglican right now. I think Anglicanism is very well set up because it's the via media between Catholic and Protestant. And I definitely think that Anglicanism is definitely, I think it has a very bright future because of the very rich and the beautiful worship of the Anglican faith. And it's just a very rich and beautiful tradition of Christianity. So that's kind of the reasons I like Anglicanism. There's a few other reasons, but, this is a short little video. And I really just like the Anglican tradition. I really would recommend visiting an Anglican or a moderate Episcopal church if you can. So you have a good day. God bless, and Christ will conquer.